He became known as a ruler whose cruelty shaped every corner of Judea, yet nothing matched the horror that began inside his own body. A violent infection struck his groin, causing massive swelling, cracking skin, and ulcers that leaked through every bandage. The flesh began to rot while he was still alive, producing a stench that filled his chambers, and physicians recorded a sight no king should endure: living worms feeding inside the decaying tissue. Herod the Great ruled Judea as a man who believed that stability could exist only when fear walked beside it. Rome supported him because he delivered what the empire wanted: a quiet province, predictable taxes, and a ruler who acted quickly when others hesitated. His authority grew out of this partnership. He crushed uprisings before they spread, placed loyal officers in every outpost, removed rivals who questioned his decisions, and rebuilt fortresses not as symbols of glory but as reminders that order must be enforced every day. Inside the palace, relatives learned that blood ties did not guarantee safety. Any hint of ambition could be interpreted as a threat, and a threat in Herod's eyes rarely survived long enough to explain itself. For many years this mixture of discipline and brutality gave him the control he needed. Judea stayed manageable, Rome approved of his results, and the court learned to read the sharp rhythm of a ruler who demanded absolute obedience. But while his political power remained firm on the surface, a quieter problem began shaping his days long before anyone could see it. It started with a burning irritation in the groin that he blamed on armor, heat, and long hours spent moving between councils and inspections. At first it seemed harmless. He washed carefully, changed linen, and tried to ignore the discomfort. The irritation returned each evening with more force, settling into the skin with a heat that felt deeper than a simple rash. Within weeks the area became swollen, and every movement pressed the inflamed tissue against the coarse folds of his clothing. The skin along the inner crease began to crack, opening into shallow sores that stung sharply when he walked. In the quiet hours before dawn he noticed a faint sour odor that washing no longer concealed. It was subtle but persistent, and it told him that the problem was no longer a matter of sweat or friction. Something had begun to take root beneath the surface. Herod continued to work with the same demand for speed and control, but the pain followed him through every meeting. He stood during councils with practiced posture, yet his weight shifted more often than before. He listened to petitions with his usual intensity, but brief flashes of discomfort tightened his jaw and shortened his patience. Long ceremonies, once routine, became silent battles against the burning pressure that rose each time he moved. Servants close enough to attend him noticed these changes without understanding their cause, and they learned to avoid drawing his attention when his expression grew strained. Physicians were summoned quietly so that no rumor would reach the court. They examined the inflamed area with cautious hands and offered explanations that avoided the truth. They spoke of heat, strain, and simple infection. They applied poultices and wrapped the groin with layers of soft cloth, but the swelling continued to grow. The ulcers widened with each day, reopening with even modest movement and releasing thin threads of cloudy discharge that soaked into the bandages. Herod felt the warmth of infection building beneath the skin, a slow internal pressure that did not respond to rest or treatment. The discomfort turned into a constant companion, and the constant presence of pain began to shape his reactions. Herod had always been wary of disloyalty, but now ordinary disagreements carried new weight. Reports of disputes in distant towns felt more urgent. Conversations at dinner sounded less respectful. A relative asking a simple question could provoke suspicion. The king who once controlled his temper with deliberate calculation now acted faster, driven not only by policy but by the strain of concealing weakness from everyone around him. Outside the palace, nothing appeared different. Rome continued to rely on him. Construction projects continued. Commanders followed his orders. But inside the palace, among those close enough to see the tightening in his movements, it was clear that something was changing. The infection that had begun as irritation was gradually spreading deeper into the tissue of the groin, turning a minor wound into a developing condition that carried the quiet rhythm of decay. And though Herod refused to admit it, even to himself, this slow and private deterioration had already begun to influence the way he ruled. Rome still saw a strong king. Judea still obeyed. But beneath the robes and the posture of control, a slow process was unfolding that would soon move faster than any decision he could make. The man who lived by the belief that any threat could be crushed was beginning to encounter the one force he could not intimidate or command, an illness growing inside his own body, shaping the future of his rule long before the world understood what had begun. Herod entered the next stage of his illness with the same determination that had defined his entire rule, yet the changes in his body were becoming too severe to ignore. The swelling in his groin no longer behaved like a simple infection. It had thickened into a heavy, painful mass that pulled at the surrounding flesh and made every movement feel strained and unsteady. The irritation that once flared only in the evenings now followed him from morning to night, and each step sent a warm pulse through the lower abdomen that left him breathless if he moved too quickly. Inside the palace, this growing strain was visible long before anyone dared speak of it. Audiences grew shorter. The king sat through meetings with an intensity that felt sharper, more brittle than before, as if he were listening for something behind the words rather than the words themselves. When pain surged, his expression changed in a way that advisors could not miss, and discussions that should have ended in negotiation instead ended with abrupt decisions delivered in a clipped, irritable tone. Servants who tended to his clothing noticed stains that returned faster than linen could be washed, and although they never spoke of it, they exchanged glances that showed they understood something was wrong. The infection deepened. The inflamed tissue around the groin became hot and tender, and the ulcers that had formed earlier now widened and bled whenever he adjusted his posture. The skin gave off a heavy warmth that even his thick robes could not hide. Physicians were summoned in secret. They spoke carefully, offering explanations that avoided alarming the king, but they could not disguise their growing concern. They applied stronger poultices and changed the bandages more frequently, yet nothing slowed the progression. Each time the wounds were uncovered, the discharge grew thicker, and the surrounding skin looked darker than the week before. This constant discomfort began to shape the king's state of mind. Herod had always been wary of disloyalty, but the fever that now rose and fell inside him sharpened that instinct into something more unpredictable. Minor disputes in distant towns seemed more urgent. A hesitation in an advisor's voice sounded like a hidden agenda. Relatives found themselves questioned not about policies but about their thoughts and intentions. The king who once relied on precise calculation began reacting to shadows of doubt fed by exhaustion and pain. Sleep brought no relief. The fever intensified at night, leaving him pacing across his chambers in long, uneven steps. Attendants heard him muttering to himself, pausing, listening, then moving again as if trying to outrun a sensation he could not escape. By morning he returned to the throne room drained but determined, forcing himself into the posture of command even as the infection pressed deeper into the tissue beneath his skin. To those outside the palace nothing seemed different. Judea continued to function. Rome continued to receive reports. Construction projects advanced. But for those who worked within the walls of the court, the change in Herod's behavior became impossible to ignore. He was still issuing orders, still directing the kingdom, but something in the tone of his rule had shifted. Where once there had been firm authority, now there was urgency. Where once there had been judgment, now there was suspicion. And beneath that suspicion lived the truth he refused to face. The illness was no longer a surface irritation. It was moving inward, altering not only his body but the way he saw the world around him. Each decision he made carried the weight of invisible pressure, and with every passing day the infection tightened its hold, drawing him toward a stage where the boundaries between pain, fear, and power would begin to blur. Herod entered a period of illness where the boundaries of his identity began to erode. The swelling in his groin had grown into a mass that distorted his stance, forcing him to walk with a slow, deliberate effort. The ulcers that once opened and closed now merged into a single expanse of raw, infected tissue, and the skin around them darkened as the body lost its ability to heal. The smell of decay followed him from room to room, subtle at first, then overwhelming in the confined spaces of his private chambers. Servants worked with downturned eyes, aware that the king sensed every reaction, even those they tried to hide. The fever rose higher than before. It blurred the edges of his thoughts, pushing him between brief moments of clarity and long stretches of disorientation. At night he woke gasping, drenched in sweat, reaching for support as the infection sent sharp waves of heat through his abdomen. Sometimes he called for guards without reason. Sometimes he whispered about conspiracies that did not exist. Sometimes he stared into the darkness as if listening to voices only he could hear. The fever was no longer a symptom, it was shaping the way he thought. And that shift did not stay inside his chambers. In the throne room he listened differently. Advisors who had served him for decades now approached him with caution. A misplaced word could trigger a suspicion. A delayed answer could be taken as evidence of betrayal. He interrupted discussions with sudden questions, demanding explanations for events that no one else considered unusual. Some days he dismissed multiple officials in a single hour, replacing them with men who understood that obedience mattered more than competence. Meanwhile the infection continued its slow destruction. The ulcers deepened, the necrosis spread, and in the worst areas small larvae appeared in the decayed tissue. Physicians recognized this as a sign of irreversible decline, but they dared not say so. They cleaned the wound with shaking hands, knowing the king could lash out if he sensed pity or fear. Nothing they did helped. The tissue broke down faster than it could be treated, and the discharge soaked through every bandage before the hour was over. The palace reacted to this transformation with silent dread. Officials avoided standing too close. Guards waited for orders with rigid posture, hoping the king's eyes would not settle on them. Nobles who once sought influence now kept their distance, knowing that proximity to Herod meant proximity to unpredictable danger. Even his relatives, once protected by their lineage, became targets of his suspicions. Some were imprisoned. Others were executed after accusations born not from evidence but from the fevered maze inside his mind. Outside the palace the kingdom began to drift. Local administrators acted without waiting for royal approval, unsure whether their messages would be read clearly or interpreted as threats. Rome received reports written in cautious language, avoiding any direct reference to the king's illness but hinting at instability. And the army, long loyal to Herod's commands, began to follow instructions with hesitation, as if sensing that the true center of authority was no longer intact. In this atmosphere the king continued to rule, though it was no longer clear who he was ruling. His voice carried through the halls, commanding arrests, approving punishments, demanding new investigations, but the logic behind those decisions came from a mind struggling against both pain and fever. The infection had moved beyond the physical. It shaped his emotions, guided his fears, and distorted his sense of reality. His kingdom still had a ruler, but the ruler was no longer the man he once had been. By the end of this stage it was clear that Judea was being governed by a combination of instinct, dread, and illness. Herod remained on the throne, but the decay within his body had already begun to erode the foundation of his authority. The palace continued to bow, the soldiers continued to stand guard, yet everyone close enough to witness the change understood the unspoken truth. The king was losing the one battle he could not control, and the disease consuming his flesh was now consuming his reign. Herod entered a stage of illness where the boundary between his body and his authority began to break down completely. The swelling in his groin had grown so heavy and distorted that his movements were reduced to a slow, deliberate sequence of gestures designed to limit the tearing of necrotic tissue. The ulcers that once formed isolated pockets of infection had merged into one continuous wound that stretched across the lower abdomen. Large sections of skin had died, leaving exposed areas where flesh darkened and softened under the heat of spreading decay. The odor rising from the wound no longer faded even in open spaces. It clung to the air around him, creating a silent barrier that everyone in the palace felt but no one dared acknowledge. The fever that accompanied this decline became a constant presence. It lifted and fell like a tide, but never fully receded, leaving the king in a state where every thought had to push through layers of exhaustion and heat. By night he drifted in and out of consciousness, waking in intervals of confusion and panic. He sometimes called for guards without knowing why. He sometimes shouted instructions that made sense only to him. At other times he lay completely still, staring at the ceiling with an expression that suggested he was trying to follow a path of thought he could no longer fully hold. The pain, the heat, and the smell formed a closed world that no advisor or servant could enter without feeling the pressure of a ruler losing the ability to separate reality from the distortions produced by his failing body. In these conditions Herod's suspicions grew sharper and more unpredictable. Messages from provincial administrators sounded like disguised warnings. Routine disagreements among ministers appeared to him as coordinated plots. A glance exchanged between two relatives could trigger an interrogation. When the fever spiked, he ordered arrests with a clarity that frightened even his closest allies. Some of those taken were political rivals. Others were family members whose only crime was speaking at the wrong moment or standing too close during an episode of pain. Each decision seemed to come from a mixture of instinct, exhaustion, and desperation, as if removing people around him could somehow slow the advance of the disease consuming him. Servants who tended to his bandages witnessed the most devastating signs of progression. The necrotic areas around the groin had grown so extensive that parts of the wound had begun to host small clusters of living larvae. Physicians recognized this as a sign that the tissue had reached a stage of decomposition the body could no longer resist. They attempted to clean the wound, but the pain was so severe that Herod lashed out in confusion, turning every attempt at treatment into an unpredictable struggle. The discharge thickened, clinging to cloth and skin alike, and no amount of cleansing could restore a sense of normality. The king who once commanded armies now found himself unable to stand without the help of attendants who feared both the illness and the man suffering from it. Inside the palace the atmosphere shifted from order to controlled panic. Official duties continued, but the rhythm of court life was now dictated by the king's condition. Ministers waited in quiet rooms, listening for signs of agitation from the royal chambers before deciding how to approach him. Some days he met them with a brittle form of calm, leaning forward with effort as he approved documents and demanded updates. Other days the fever seized him, and he shouted accusations that sent advisors fleeing from the room before his guards closed the doors behind them. Soldiers once proud of his strength now obeyed his orders with a tension that betrayed their uncertainty. They knew the king was still alive, but they also knew that his judgment no longer came from the calculated force that defined his rule. Executions increased. Some were public. Others were carried out in hidden corners of the palace. Reports of conspiracies, whether real or imagined, led to interrogations that unfolded under the weight of the king's desperation. Families fell apart as relatives were removed in the middle of the night. Officials sent messages to Rome in carefully chosen language, avoiding direct references to the king's condition while describing the kingdom in terms that hinted at instability. Those closest to Herod understood that the true danger no longer came from outside enemies but from the internal world of the ruler himself, a world shaped by pain, fever, and a spreading infection that consumed both flesh and reason. Through all this Herod clung to the routines of power with an intensity that revealed how deeply he feared losing control. He continued issuing orders, approving construction, and demanding reports from distant cities, even when he could barely sit upright. What remained of his authority now rested on momentum alone, driven by a man who refused to acknowledge that his mind and body were collapsing under the weight of a disease that no one could stop. The palace functioned because fear kept it moving, not because the king provided direction. And each day the distance between appearance and reality widened. By this stage it had become clear that the kingdom was being governed not by policy but by the unstable reactions of a ruler caught between physical agony and the hallucinations produced by fever. Judea still had a king in title, but the power behind that title was fading. What remained was a man fighting a private battle against a spreading decay that no decree, fortress, or execution could hold back, a battle that was reshaping the entire kingdom long before it reached its final stage. By the final stage of his illness, Herod no longer lived as a ruler who answered to Rome or to the courts of Judea. He lived inside a shrinking world defined by fever, confusion, and a wound that had grown far beyond anything physicians could manage. The swelling in his groin had reached a size that distorted the entire posture of his body, pulling him forward as he tried to balance the weight of tissue that no longer held its shape. The necrosis had advanced into the lower abdomen, softening the flesh and creating areas where the skin no longer protected what lay beneath. The smell of decay filled his chambers from morning to night, pushing attendants to work with quiet urgency while trying not to draw attention to their discomfort. The larvae that physicians first noticed in small numbers now appeared whenever bandages were removed, a sign that the tissue had deteriorated to a level the body could not resist. They were cleaned away each time, but they returned just as quickly, creating a cycle that left everyone aware of how far the illness had progressed. Herod felt the presence of the infection in every breath he took. The pain traveled through his legs and abdomen in long, punishing waves that left him gripping whatever surface he could find. During these moments he spoke in short, fractured phrases, trying to stay upright while the fever rose around him like a burning fog. The court tried to maintain the appearance of order, but the reality inside the palace could not be hidden. Advisors arrived to meetings unsure whether the king would recognize them or accuse them of treason. Some days he listened for several minutes, nodding slowly while attendants supported his weight. Other days he interrupted with sudden bursts of anger, convinced that the kingdom was slipping away through secret alliances he could no longer track. The fever carried him between clarity and delusion without warning, and those standing before him learned to watch his face for signs of pressure building behind his eyes. Executions in this final period became less a matter of political judgment and more a reflection of the instability shaping his mind. Relatives who had served him for years were removed from the palace after a single argument. Ministers who hesitated in their reports found themselves accused of withholding information. Guards who glanced at one another in confusion were questioned for signs of disloyalty. The palace functioned under a weight of fear so heavy that every conversation sounded quiet and measured, as if the air itself might carry words to the wrong ears. At the same time, the kingdom beyond the palace began to drift away from his direct control. Rome received messages describing a ruler too ill to travel and too unstable to negotiate. Local administrators made decisions on their own initiative, knowing they might not receive coherent orders. Construction projects slowed as resources were redirected toward maintaining the appearance of stability. Even the army, loyal for decades, began to move more cautiously, aware that the king's authority was now carried by tradition rather than by the force of his commands. Inside his chambers, Herod fought against his own decline with the same intensity he once used on his political enemies. He demanded treatment long after physicians admitted there was nothing more they could do. He ordered guards to tighten security around him, convinced that those closest to him were waiting for a moment of weakness. He attempted to stand and collapsed into attendants' arms, trembling from the heat that radiated from the infected flesh. Each effort to assert control reminded him of how little strength remained, and the contrast between his past authority and his present condition weighed on him more heavily than the illness itself. In his final days, the boundary between fever and thought dissolved almost entirely. He spoke to people who were not in the room. He issued commands that contradicted those he had given the day before. He called for relatives he had already executed. The decay spreading through his body shaped every sound he made, every gesture, every fear. The man who once rebuilt fortresses and suppressed uprisings now lay in a chamber where even standing had become an impossible task. Yet the most striking part of his last days was not the physical deterioration but the way the kingdom continued to orbit him out of habit. Officials still entered with scrolls. Guards still saluted. Servants still prepared the room each morning. The machinery of the state moved around a man who could no longer guide it, revealing how much of his authority had existed only because others believed it was unshakable. And as his illness erased the last traces of clarity, the kingdom slowly adjusted to a reality in which its ruler was alive but no longer ruling. When the end finally came, it was not marked by a dramatic moment. It arrived quietly, as his breath slowed and the fever that had driven him for weeks settled into a final stillness. The court announced his death with the solemnity expected of a king, but those who had witnessed the last months understood that his power had died long before his body did. The decay that consumed him had stripped away not only his strength but the structure of fear and precision that once held Judea together. And in the silence that followed, the kingdom began the difficult process of rebuilding itself after a ruler whose final battle had been fought not against armies or political rivals, but against the relentless collapse of his own body and mind.